The soft morning light filtered through the sprawling branches of the ancient oak that had stood sentinel on Ethan Carter's property for more than a century and a half. In his quiet suburban haven, a charming colonial home with wide porches, meticulous gardens, and memories tucked into every corner. This 150-year-old oak wasn't merely a tree. It was a living testament to family legacy, community history, and the passage of time. Ethan, a decorated military veteran who had seamlessly transitioned into a dedicated city official, found solace in the simple rhythms of life. When not working long hours at the city office, he devoted his free time to restoring classic cars, a passion that connected him to the craftsmanship and heritage of bygone eras. Yet nothing inspired Ethan more than the oak tree, whose gnarled branches and rich foliage had witnessed generations of family picnics, quiet reflections, and neighborhood celebrations. It was his pride, a natural monument that rooted him in a past too precious to lose. That peaceful morning, as Ethan knelt in his flower bed trimming a rose bush, an unexpected visitor shattered the quiet. Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of HOA order, strode up the driveway with an entourage of smug board members in tow. Dressed in a crisp blazer and armed with a clipboard, she fixed her steely gaze on the oak. "Ethan, we need to talk," she declared without preamble. Her eyes, cold and calculating, swept over the majestic tree before locking on him. "What seems to be the problem?" Ethan asked, wiping soil from his calloused hands and trying to mask the unease rising in his chest. He had long learned that Karen's tone meant trouble. Trouble for his home, his memories, and the very spirit of the neighborhood. Karen's reply was as brisk as it was shocking. "This tree is a blight on our community's landscape. Its archaic, sprawling form does nothing for the uniform aesthetic we demand. The board has decided that in order to achieve a better view for everyone, it must be removed." For a split second, silence reigned. Ethan's mind raced. He knew that the oak was not only a piece of nature, but a symbol of his family's history. "Karen," he said, his voice a blend of disbelief and sorrow, "that tree is part of my home. It's not just wood and leaves. It's history, a living archive. You can't simply decide to cut it down to satisfy some misguided notion of order." Her eyes narrowed into slits as she retorted coolly, "Rules are rules, Ethan. The HOA is entrusted with maintaining community standards. Personal sentiment has no place in our decisions." Even as she handed him an envelope containing what looked like a stern warning, her tone left no room for discussion. In that charged moment, the two worlds collided. On one side was Ethan, steady, sentimental, and determined to honor the legacy embodied by his oak tree. On the other was Karen, the embodiment of strict regulation and a modern aesthetic that left no space for history or emotion. The confrontation was brief yet searing, setting the stage for an escalating battle between individual conviction and institutional overreach. Ethan's heart pounded as he clutched the warning close. Little did he know, this was only the opening salvo in a long, uphill struggle, a struggle that would soon pit his quiet dignity against an HOA determined to reshape the neighborhood in its own uncompromising image. The next day, Ethan awoke to find his front door bearing an official envelope marked with the HOA seal. Inside lay a notice for a $750 fine, a penalty for violating community property aesthetics. The cited infraction? That his venerable oak tree, with its natural irregular silhouette, did not conform to the so-called standards of the community. Karen's message was unambiguous. Within 30 days the tree must be removed or the fines would only multiply. It was a power move designed to silence any dissent and force compliance. Stunned yet resolute, Ethan examined the documentation, recalling his conversation with Karen from the previous day. He knew this wasn't a simple misunderstanding, but a deliberate attempt to bulldoze his cherished heritage away. Determined not to be cowed by arbitrary rule enforcement, Ethan gathered every scrap of evidence he could find, a trove of historical records, local preservation documents, and even testimonials from longtime neighbors attesting to the oak's significance. Armed with these papers, he marched to the local zoning office to challenge the fine and question the legitimacy of the HOA's demands. Meanwhile, Karen stood like a general on the battlefield of suburban conformity. On her manicured lawn, she surveyed the neighborhood with an air of self-satisfaction. "The rules apply to everyone, Ethan," she would repeatedly insist, her voice echoing in the corridors of power she had built. In her mind, preserving a pristine, uniform community was worth any sacrifice, even one steeped in history. Yet Ethan was unmoved. "These are empty threats," he mused. Not long after his visit to the zoning office, a small team of inspectors arrived at his property. Clad in uniforms and armed with clipboards, they circled the ancient oak, meticulously noting down every imperfection. Their presence was not just procedural. It was a clear signal that no one, no matter how long they'd nurtured a living piece of history, was above the HOA's strict and intrusive mandate. Ethan watched from behind a cluster of hydrangeas as the inspectors measured, snapped photographs, and recorded every detail of the tree's rugged beauty. The absurdity of treating a 150-year-old oak as a mere violation was not lost on him. In that moment, his grief deepened, but so did his determination. Over the following days, Karen's tactics grew even bolder. At neighborhood gatherings, she made public statements declaring that the oak was an eyesore and even a potential hazard, a danger to the community's visual harmony. Rumors circulated that anonymous complaints had been filed against Ethan's property, conveniently justifying further action. Board members, many of whom were seduced by Karen's charismatic authority, nodded in agreement as she reiterated her unwavering stance. Despite the mounting pressure, Ethan remained calm. At a local civic center meeting, he stood before his fellow residents and presented his carefully gathered evidence. "This tree," he explained with quiet passion, "has stood for 150 years. It has witnessed our community's growth, our celebrations, and our hardships. It is more than an object to be regulated. It is a living piece of our heritage." His words stirred memories in those present, and murmurs of sympathy began to ripple through the crowd. But Karen was relentless. "The HOA's duty is to maintain order," she countered coldly, dismissing Ethan's emotional appeal as irrelevant. Her tone brooked no opposition. It was the voice of someone who believed that absolute adherence to rules was the only path to progress. Yet with every overzealous act, from the fine to the intrusive inspections, Ethan's resolve only hardened. The fine taped to his door, the inspectors prowling his yard, and the public derision from Karen's mouth. All these moves were part of a calculated power play. Ethan was not just defending a tree. He was defending the very soul of a community that had been slowly overrun by bureaucratic tyranny. And as the conflict began to crystallize, the stage was set for an epic showdown between a man devoted to history and an institution obsessed with control. Within days of the fine's delivery, it became clear that Karen was orchestrating a far more sinister campaign than anyone had anticipated. What began as an effort to remove an old oak tree had evolved into a full-scale assault on personal property and community history. Late one night, as Ethan sat hunched over piles of documents in his modest study, a sharp knock at the door jolted him. Opening it, he found a courier delivering another official notice, a document so foreboding it threatened that failure to comply would eventually result in property seizure. The language was unambiguous and legalistic, leaving little doubt that this was more than a mere fine. It was an outright declaration of war. Ethan's heart pounded as he read the paper. This was no longer about aesthetics. It was about power, an attempt by the HOA to strip him of everything he held dear. Refusing to yield, he began digging deeper into the HOA's archives. Late nights turned into early mornings as he pored over meeting minutes, financial statements, and contracts. Every document revealed a tapestry of dubious fines, unexplained charges, and a troubling pattern of behavior from Karen and her inner circle. His investigation soon uncovered startling irregularities. Fines were often fabricated or exorbitantly inflated, and several board members had rubber-stamped decisions without proper authorization. One former board member, now estranged and remorseful, quietly contacted Ethan with damning information. Karen had been siphoning HOA funds for her own personal luxuries, all hidden behind the guise of community improvements. Realizing that he now possessed evidence that could topple the oppressive regime, Ethan set up discreet cameras around his property. focusing particularly on the approaches to his yard and the area around the oak tree. He recorded every interaction, every creak of the gate, every conversation overheard, and every unwarranted inspection was captured as a testament to the abuse of power unfolding before him. The HOA's tactics grew increasingly brazen. Anonymous complaints began pouring in from residents, complaints about misaligned fences, overgrown hedges, and even trivial matters that had been blown out of proportion. It became evident that Karen was amassing ammunition to justify her aggressive measures. At one particularly heated board meeting, a dissenting board member dared to question the legitimacy of Karen's decisions. His objections were swiftly and violently shut down by Karen's acerbic retorts and the reluctant nods of his colleagues. At a subsequent HOA meeting held in a Stark community hall, Ethan presented his findings. Using photographs, audio recordings, and video footage of unauthorized inspections, he laid out a clear pattern of abuse. These documents, he said, voice steady and resolute, prove that your fines are not about community standards, but about control and personal gain. This tree, which has stood for 150 years, is part of our living heritage. Its preservation is a duty we owe to ourselves and to future generations. The room fell into a heavy silence. Whispers turned into murmurs of support as neighbors recalled their own encounters with arbitrary fines and intrusive inspections. Even some longtime supporters of Karen began to question whether the cost of maintaining her stringent vision was worth the collateral damage inflicted upon their lives. For Karen, the backlash was both unexpected and unwelcome. In a show of forced composure, she dismissed Ethan's evidence as misinterpretations and exaggerated claims. "We all must make sacrifices for the sake of progress," she declared, though her eyes betrayed a hint of desperation. As the standoff deepened, Ethan's fight evolved into something much larger than a single property dispute. It became a crusade against an institutional overreach that threatened the community's identity. Late into the night, while neighbors exchanged stories of their own grievances, Ethan reviewed every piece of evidence he had collected. Every snapshot and recorded conversation bolstered his resolve. He was not just fighting for his tree. He was fighting for every homeowner whose voice had been silenced by an unaccountable system. In that quiet, solitary vigil, it became clear the seeds of rebellion had been sown, and the community was beginning to awaken. Karen's campaign of intimidation had inadvertently ignited a spark that would soon blaze into a full-fledged battle for justice, transparency, and the preservation of a cherished past. On a frosty winter morning, Ethan was startled awake by the low rumble of heavy machinery outside. Rushing to his front yard, he was met with an almost surreal sight. Contractors in company uniforms had parked excavators and bulldozers on his lawn, their purpose unmistakable. At the center of the impending demolition stood his ancient oak, majestic yet vulnerable, now marked for destruction. Today, for the benefit of the community's future, Karen announced over a megaphone as she supervised the operation, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. Neighbors gathered at a distance, equally horrified and transfixed. Ethan's pulse raced as he realized the full extent of Karen's overreach. Without waiting for any formal court order or proper legal process, she was about to erase a living piece of history. Without hesitation, Ethan retrieved his phone and began recording every moment, the clanking of machinery, the grim determination in Karen's eyes, and the silent, pleading stance of the oak. This wasn't just vandalism. It was a flagrant abuse of power that needed to be documented for all to see. Later that day, in a packed community hall at the next HOA meeting, Ethan stood before his neighbors and presented his evidence. The projector screen flickered to life with footage of the morning's events. "This tree is not an impediment. It is a living archive of our community's history," he declared, his voice resonating with passion. "Karen, you have no right to erase our past in the name of progress." As the room filled with murmurs and gasps, several residents recounted similar experiences, stories of arbitrary fines, invasive inspections, and petty infractions used as pretexts for overreach. The collective realization that their lives had been micromanaged under a banner of community improvement sparked a palpable energy in the hall. Yet Karen remained unmoved. With a dismissive wave, she countered, "Sometimes change is painful. Sacrifices must be made for the greater good." Her words, meant to justify destruction, only further inflamed the room. The evidence, crisp video of heavy machinery inching toward a revered tree, spoke for itself. Galvanized by the overwhelming support, Ethan forged ahead. Over the following days, he worked closely with a team of local lawyers and historical preservation experts to mount a legal challenge. Media outlets soon picked up the story, and Save Our Oak became a rallying cry. Protests formed outside the HOA office. Banners demanded accountability, and chants of Save Our History echoed through the neighborhood streets. At home, as Ethan surveyed the marks of gouges and scratches on the oak's scarred trunk, a quiet resolve settled in. Though his heart ached at the loss of a symbol so dear, the blatant assault on his property, and by extension, on everyone's heritage, could not be ignored. In a bold move of defiance, he organized a community rally on his front lawn. Neighbors who had long endured Karen's draconian measures gathered together to share their stories and to reclaim their rights. That evening, beneath the dim glow of streetlights and the lingering chill of winter air, voices united in a chorus of determination. Every personal account, every tear shed for a loss both tangible and symbolic, helped fortify the community's resolve. It was now a battle not only for Ethan's home, but for the very essence of the neighborhood itself. As the rally dispersed into the night, it was clear. Karen's unchecked authority had sparked a revolution, a movement fueled by a shared love for history and an unyielding desire for justice. The lines were drawn, and Ethan's stand had set the wheels of change irrevocably in motion. Cornered by the united front of a community awakened, Karen's tactics took on a new, desperate edge. In a final bid to reclaim control, she resolved to employ extreme measures, ones that would soon expose her true colors to all. On a stormy evening, as gray clouds gathered overhead, Karen initiated her most audacious maneuver yet. Under the guise of protecting public order, she arranged for a call to the local police, falsely reporting a public disturbance at Ethan's property. The pretext? That Ethan's defiant stance and the uproar surrounding his beloved oak had escalated into a threat to community safety. When the police arrived, they found Ethan calmly tending to his garden, completely unperturbed by the commotion. As officers began questioning him, Karen appeared on the scene, her voice trembling with contrived indignation. "There's been a serious disruption here," she insisted, her tone forcing an air of authority. But when Ethan flashed his city official badge, the facade crumbled. The officers soon recognized the absurdity of the situation. Not willing to let her plan collapse, Karen escalated further. She discreetly hired a private investigator tasked with unearthing any unsavory details about Ethan, anything that could discredit his fight. Late that night, while most of the neighborhood slept, Ethan's security cameras captured footage of a shadowy figure creeping around his property, peering furtively through windows and attempting to breach a side gate. The video, grainy yet damning, was quickly shared with local media and community members alike. At the next HOA meeting, held in a cramped conference room filled with anxious residents, Ethan took the floor once more. This time, he presented the incriminating footage alongside a dossier of Karen's misdeeds. "Your tactics have crossed every legal line," he stated, his voice resonating with authority. "Not only have you repeatedly violated our trust, but you have also resorted to illegal methods to intimidate those who stand for what is right." The room erupted with murmurs of outrage and disbelief. Even longtime supporters of Karen shifted uncomfortably in their seats. With every piece of evidence displayed, a video of the covert investigator, testimonies from neighbors who'd witnessed unannounced forays into their properties, Karen's veneer of control began to crumble before everyone's eyes. Desperation turned to frantic denials as Karen stammered, "This is all a misunderstanding. I'm only trying to maintain order." But her words rang hollow amid the mounting evidence and the collective outcry of the community. In that moment, her final, desperate move not only failed to silence Ethan, but instead unmasked her as a tyrant willing to break every rule she once claimed to uphold. The fallout was swift. Neighbors, emboldened by the revelations, flooded the meeting with impassioned testimonies of harassment, arbitrary fines, and intrusive inspections. The room became a forum of shared grievances, a space where personal indignations merged into a unified demand for justice. With each story, Karen's authority shrank further until she was reduced to a figure of bitter humiliation. By the time the meeting adjourned, it was clear. Karen's days of unchecked power were over. Her reckless tactics had united the community in a way that could not be undone. In her attempt to intimidate one man, she had inadvertently galvanized an entire neighborhood to stand up and demand accountability. In the wake of Karen's public blunders, a palpable shift swept through the community. What began as a solitary stand by Ethan had blossomed into a collective uprising, a force so powerful that even the HOA's once impregnable structure began to crumble. In the days that followed the explosive HOA meeting, neighbors who had long suffered in silence stepped forward with their own stories of arbitrary fines, unannounced inspections, and relentless harassment. Fueled by Ethan's evidence and the undeniable footage of Karen's overreach, a special referendum was scheduled. With record turnout and overwhelming support for change, the community voted decisively to remove Karen from her position as HOA president. It wasn't just a rejection of one person. It was a demand for accountability, transparency, and respect for the very history that the oak tree symbolized. As the referendum results were announced, Karen's authority evaporated. Her once respected status gave way to public scorn. In a symbolic act of community retribution, her own home, an ostentatious display of her former power, was listed for sale almost overnight. For many, the move signified a cleansing of the neighborhood, a chance to begin anew without the shadow of tyranny. Ethan, standing on his porch with a bittersweet mix of triumph and mourning, watched as the tide turned. Though the oak tree had been scarred by the heavy machinery and relentless enforcement, its loss had sparked a movement that united the community. Neighbors began sharing stories at town hall meetings, and the call for reform grew louder with each passing day. The city, pressured by the united voices of its residents, launched a formal investigation into the HOA's practices. Every transaction, every meeting minute was scrutinized, revealing a web of financial irregularities and unauthorized actions that pointed directly to Karen's mismanagement. Legal proceedings were swift and uncompromising. The city imposed record fines on the HOA, and several board members found themselves summoned to testify before local officials. As details emerged of misappropriated funds and egregious abuses of power, the very institution that had once been seen as a guardian of community standards was exposed as a hotbed of corruption. The media, captivated by the dramatic reversal of fortunes, began referring to the saga as the fall of Karen. Headlines celebrated Ethan's quiet defiance and the collective triumph of a community that had finally reclaimed its identity. For Ethan, the victory was bittersweet. The loss of his beloved oak tree, a living relic of the past, remained a personal wound. Yet, as he sipped his morning coffee on a now peaceful porch, he recognized that from the ashes of that loss, a renewed spirit of unity and justice had emerged. Slowly but surely, the HOA was reformed. New board members, longtime residents who valued history and community over blind adherence to arbitrary rules, were elected. Public spaces were revitalized, and local ordinances were rewritten to include protections for heritage sites and natural landmarks. The legal and administrative reforms set forth in the aftermath of the uprising promised that such abuses of power would never again be tolerated. In the end, the collapse of the corrupt HOA wasn't just a personal victory for Ethan. It was a watershed moment for the entire community. The battle had been hard-fought, but the collective determination to honor the past had won out, laying the groundwork for a future defined by transparency, mutual respect, and a deep reverence for history. With the HOA's internal power structure shattered, local authorities moved swiftly to impose legal consequences. Investigations revealed a labyrinth of financial irregularities, unauthorized spending, and blatant violations of municipal regulations. Homeowners, led by Ethan and a coalition of community advocates, filed a high-profile class action lawsuit against the HOA. The suit not only sought financial redress, but also demanded sweeping reforms to prevent any future abuse of power. In a packed courtroom that buzzed with the energy of a united community, Ethan took the stand. He recounted, with measured determination, the relentless series of violations that had beset his property, from baseless fines and unapproved inspections to the overtly aggressive actions designed to force him into submission. His testimony resonated with everyone present. Each detail underscored the magnitude of the HOA's misdeeds. Legal experts quickly dubbed the case a landmark victory for homeowner rights. "This is a turning point," one attorney remarked, "a clear message that no institution is above the law." The city, eager to restore public trust, levied record fines on the HOA. Several board members were summoned to testify, and even Karen's longtime lawyer found himself entangled in the investigation after evidence emerged of forged documents and misrepresented board decisions. Amid the courtroom battles, the community saw real change. The City Council enacted new regulations that imposed strict oversight on homeowners associations, mandating full transparency in all financial dealings and safeguarding the rights of residents. Ethan, ever the tireless advocate, helped draft a new set of guidelines for the reformed HOA, a blueprint designed to ensure that the corruption of the past would never be repeated. The lawsuit, while arduous and emotionally draining, culminated in a decisive victory. The full legal consequences imposed on the HOA sent a resounding message. When an institution betrays its community, collective action and the rule of law will prevail. For every homeowner who had been wronged, this legal triumph was a vindication. And for Ethan, it was the final power move that cemented his status as a champion of justice. As the legal case against the HOA reached its climax, Karen's personal world began to unravel. Once the iron-fisted enforcer of neighborhood order, she now found herself the subject of relentless public scrutiny and media ridicule. The very tactics she had used to intimidate and control were turned back upon her, exposing her as a master of deception and abuse. Rumors of her extravagant spending, funded by misappropriated HOA funds, spread quickly. Within days, her prized car was repossessed, and whispers circulated that her financial misdeeds had caught up with her. Her once immaculate home, a symbol of her authority, was swiftly put on the market in a symbolic purge of her tainted legacy. Matters worsened on the personal front. Karen's relentless pursuit of power had cost her dearly. Her husband, long a silent partner in her schemes, finally filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and the crushing burden of her unbridled ambition. Friends and former allies distanced themselves as her public persona crumbled, leaving her isolated and defenseless against the torrent of legal and personal repercussions. The final blow came during a heated encounter at City Hall. As Karen argued bitterly with officials over the final stages of the HOA's dissolution, her once commanding voice faltered. The confident, imperious woman who had once ruled the neighborhood was reduced to a figure of desperation, a living cautionary tale. Later that day, Ethan encountered her alone at a small cafe. Seated at a corner table, Karen's eyes were downcast, and the aura of authority that had once defined her was nowhere to be found. A longtime neighbor later remarked, "I never imagined the day would come when Karen, the queen of rules, would be seen defeated over a cup of coffee." Every headline, every whispered conversation, and every courtroom testimony reinforced one undeniable truth. Karen's reign was over. Her personal downfall was as complete as it was inevitable, a stark reminder that no one is immune to the consequences of abusing power. For Ethan, witnessing Karen's collapse was bittersweet. While he did not revel in another's misfortune, the fall of the tyrant signified a hard-won victory for the community. It was the poetic justice that had been so desperately needed, a final reckoning for a woman who had once tried to erase history and silence the voices of those she ruled.